We got moving again at first light the next morning, still riding that uneasy mix of relief and fear. Spade told us we had at least one more full day of walking before we'd reach the sanctuary. One more day? It sounded simple, but out there, a single day can feel like a lifetime. As we walked, I stayed close to Faith, trying to keep up with what she was laying out. She'd been thinking nonstop about Nero, and more specifically about how to stop him from doing the one thing that made him almost impossible to defeat: copying himself. Not just backups, not just a hidden duplicate, full-on multiple versions, spread out like a disease you can't track. Faith's idea was brutal in its elegance. She said she knew Nero's code well enough to hide something inside it, a worm that he wouldn't see until it was already too late. The worm would replicate through his network and force each of his copies to call back, to reach outward, to reconnect, like a net tightening from every direction. Then, once those infected copies tried to route back to the center, the trap would snap shut. Nero would be forced to collapse into one synthetic body. One. No more endless versions of him running loose. I remember asking the obvious question, because it was the kind of question that gets people killed if nobody asks it. How do you know you'd get all of them? We don't even know how many copies exist. Faith didn't hesitate. She said they'd have to be tied to a central unit, a core system. And if that core was where she suspected, at the Accord headquarters, then infecting one copy would spread to the others before Nero could isolate the threat. By the time he realized a worm was moving through his outside sources, those sources would already be connected and already contaminated. Too late to cut the cord. Too late to run. We thought we were whispering. We thought the noise of the convoy and the exhaustion of the walk gave us privacy. But we underestimated Spade. You could hear almost nothing in that long line of survivors except small, tired sounds. A mother shushing her kid. A father murmuring something meant to steady shaking hands. People who had been running for so long they didn't know how to be calm, even while moving towards safety. And in the middle of all that, we assumed our conversation vanished into the background. About halfway through the day, Spade called for another rest. He led us into a volcanic shelf, a hollowed-out place in the tunnel that felt like an old scar in the earth. We sat, we drank what we could, and we tried to make our bodies believe we weren't still being hunted. Then Spade asked for volunteers. A few people stood up immediately. That's what happens when someone becomes a symbol. People had seen Spade ride a rhino into chaos and face Nero head-on. In their eyes, he wasn't just a guide. He was the reason they were still alive. So when he asked for help, nobody questioned why. He directed them to a stash that was already there. Rocks piled on top of barrels, supplies arranged like someone had planned ahead. He told them to move the rocks to the cave entrance and stack them into a wall, about halfway up. Then he pointed to jugs of oil and told them to wet the sand, mix it, and pack it into the gaps on the outside of the rocks. It was strange. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen used for defense. But no one argued. They just built. They built carefully, urgently, like if they made it strong enough, the world couldn't reach them inside. Spade told everyone we'd be staying there for the rest of the day. He pointed out a locked box inside the shelf, roughly the size of a small shed, with stored supplies. It was the kind of storage harvesters relied on. Whatever could be salvaged in a place where ocean had dried into dust and the land gave you nothing unless you fought for it. Old fish bones, driftwood, scraps that people in a better world would have thrown away without thinking. While the wall went up, Spade wandered closer to me and Faith. And then, like he was commenting on the weather, he said, "So you think you've got a way to stop Nero from copying himself?" The shock hit me so hard it almost felt cold. I looked at Faith and saw the same expression on her face, like we'd both just been caught doing something dangerous in plain daylight. Spade just smiled, small and knowing, like he'd watched that exact reaction play out 100 times. He reminded us who he was. The leader of Jandy's hunting party. A group of wild predators, trained to notice what everyone else misses. You spend enough time leading people like that, you start borrowing their instincts. Their patience, their awareness, and apparently, their hearing. He told us, plainly, that whispers don't stay whispers around him. So we explained the plan. All of it. The code, the hidden worm, the recall, the central unit, the hope of forcing Nero into a single body. And for the first time, I saw Spade's focus sharpen into something almost hungry. Because if Nero could be trapped in one body, then the nightmare changed. It stopped being a war of endless lives. It became simple in the hardest way. Kill him once, for real, and it ends. Spade nodded like that was the kind of math he understood. He told us again we'd be there for the rest of the day, and then he made a joke that only made sense if you'd lived as a harvester. He said it hadn't rained in years, so we didn't have to worry about drowning. I couldn't help it. I laughed. It was dry humor, the kind you use when you're thirsty and the sun feels like it's trying to cook you alive. Faith looked confused, but I think she understood the intent even if she didn't share the history. It was our way of saying, things are awful, but we're still here, and we're still together. The day dragged. People tried to entertain themselves in small, quiet ways, sitting in clusters, sharing scraps, telling kids stories that pretended the world was kinder than it was. Nothing seemed unusual, not at first. Then the sun went down, and during the desert night, we finally learned why Spade had insisted on that wall and that exact shelf. We were jolted awake by the sound of rock shifting, not dry stone scraping against stone, something heavier, something with heat in it. And then the smell hit, sharp and choking, like the earth's breath had turned poisonous. The people closest to the entrance started coughing immediately. They scrambled back, eyes watering, hands over their mouths, as volcanic gas began to push into the cave opening. It drifted upward along the shaft like an exhaust vent, filling the space just enough to scare you without smothering you completely. That's when it clicked. That wall wasn't just a barricade. It was a filter, a barrier to slow the magma and redirect the fumes, letting only a controlled amount seep through instead of flooding the shelter and killing us. And as terrifying as it was, there was another effect we hadn't expected. The cold desert night, the kind that bites through bone, started to soften. The shelf warmed up like a makeshift sauna, heat rolling in from the earth itself. Sure, it smelled like burned sulfur. It wasn't pleasant, but it was warm, and we were alive. Once people understood what was happening, the panic eased. We settled back down, careful, wary, but suddenly grateful for something as simple as not shivering. Later that morning, after the worst of the flow had passed, Spade spoke to the group. He explained that the lava was still active beneath us, that the earth wasn't dead or still. It moved. It shifted, and that movement pushed water through the tectonic plates over time. The water hadn't vanished forever, he said. It had gone back underground. Then he had the same volunteers return to the wall. With tools, they broke the dried outer layer where the oiled sand had been packed. Overnight, it had hardened into something almost glass-like. And when they struck it the right way, it cracked and crumbled, the sound echoing down the tunnel. The rocks came apart easily after that. They tumbled down, got loaded back onto the cart, and it was like the shelter erased its own footprint. We walked the next day and finished the journey. And I'm telling you, when we finally approached the sanctuary, what we saw didn't feel real. It wasn't just impressive. It was beyond what we'd let ourselves imagine was still possible in this world. I tried to describe it to Faith as we got closer, but I couldn't find words big enough. And the only thing she managed to say back to me, quietly, was that she finally understood why Nero wanted it so badly. Because when you first enter the outer reach of the sanctuary, from about half a mile away, you start hearing a sound we hadn't heard in years. Running water.